Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second lecture on Ruskin Bond's All Roads Lead to Ganga. Now, in the first segment, we had talked about his description of the territory at Dehradun and Mussoorie. Now, in the second part of the travelogue, and we've seen how Ruskin Bond makes this distinction between the novel and the travelogue, that the travelogue is largely winding and sort of without any specific rigor of direction. In the second part of the travelogue, Bond travels to the five tirthas, as it were, the five major tirthas on the Himalayas associated with the Ganga. Now, the theme is, of course, within the book related with the flora, the fauna, the territories, the locations associated with the tirthas and the river. But it is the second section that really concentrates on the various aspects and the various, I will call, the various facades of the Ganga, as it were. Now, yesterday when I closed the class, I just mentioned one small point, that Ruskin Bond suggests that the Ganga is not really one river, but it's a conglomeration of rivers, actually. Right, in the sense that it brings together many kinds of rivers within itself. And he will, of course, now talk about the alakananda, he will talk about the Mandakini, he will talk about the Bhagirathi as constituting the Ganga, and how these various Gangas, as it were, combine to create the final shape of the river that flows downstream. And the other thing that Ruskin Bond suggests is also how the Ganga and in the hills associated with the Ganga from which it descends has a kind of a magic and an aura which is associated with the Tirtha. One. Secondly, what does the Ganga mean for the people of the valleys? I mean, say, what about the local residents? What role does the Ganga have to play in their lives? Right. And within this narrative, he will also posit his own self. As I said, a self which is situated both as an European and as an Indian. Indian in the sense that he's intimately familiar with the people, the location, the trees, and European in the sense that he's both, within the territory and also outside it in the sense that he's looking with a certain degree of criticality at the Hindu myth of the pilgrimage and the hills. So it is with this perspective that he actually comes to the first chapter of these sections. This is actually the seventh chapter of the book, which is titled Along the Mandakini. And this is a trip that takes him to Kedarnath. Now, before I do that, it is important for you to look at two maps once again. And I'll share my screen so that we can take an exact look at which route Bond is actually following. And this is the route, the map that we saw earlier also. This is where Ruskin Bond would be traveling from. You see, this is Haridwar, this is Rishikesh, and this is where he will be moving towards Uttarkashi and Gupta Kashi and Kedarnath. This is the Kedar route. You see, this is Rudraprayag, about which he will talk about. The Prayag, of course, is the meeting of the rivers. And then he moves across this territory and moves straight to Kedarnath. Right. This is the route that he will take. Now, of course, he will take other routes as well. And I'll share those, the Panchakedar also with you. This is what the Panchakedar would look like. So he's traveling from Dehradun to Rishikesh, and he's moving by this route, and he's traveling via Rudraprayag. This is Rudraprayag to Kedarnath. Right. And he talks about the five Kedars here. Kedarnath is the hump or the back of Lord Shiva. He will also, of course, talk about Tunganath. Tunganath is here. which signifies the arms of Shiva. Mother Maheshwar, which is here, and this is also pretty steep, which will talk about the belly of Shiva, Mother Maheshwar. Rudranath is the face, and Kalpeshwar is the hair and the thread. So he will talk about Kedarnath, he'll talk about Tunganath. The remaining three he will not talk about. He would rather talk about Badrinath and Gangotri and Nandanath later on. Nanda Prayag, I'm sorry. Now, Bond makes a very interesting statement that, you see, he makes this distinction between the three rivers that form the Ganga. One is the Mandakini, the other is the Alakananda, and the third, of course, is Bhagirathi, the river which is probably the most sacred of them all, which is seen as the source of the Ganga at Gomukh. Now, when he talks about Mandakini and Alakananda, he makes crucial differences. He suggests that the Mandakini is a much placid river. It is associated with greenery, it moves slower, whereas the Alakananda, he says, is a far faster, it's a more destructive river which is associated with a topography that is barren. So it's making two kinds of rivers also, in the sense that in one, Ganga is destructive, not only destructive, but maybe it is faster, it creates, or the lack of vegetation, and in the other it is more bountiful, it provides more forests and so on and so forth. Now he then goes on to talk about Rudraprayag first, because he's traveling up this territory, as it were. Let me come back to this map maybe. And he suggests, of course, that Rudraprayag is hotter, it is on a much lower slope, as it were. But it is interesting that Bond's narrative is interspersed with references to Europeans. Now, this is interesting in the sense that while there is an identification with the Indian population and an analysis of the poverty, their anecdotes with reference to their living and lifestyles, Bond periodically goes back to the Europeans who've made this terrain, as it were, famous and have contributed to it. Now, yesterday we talked about identity, remember, and how Bond suggests that it is not race or religion that makes identity, but essentially with that history makes identity. And Bond seems to suggest that the Ganga, which is the source of civilization for the Hindus, also has a strong presence of the European civilization, as it were. And this is where he says, he talks about the people who have been beneficial to the Garhwal region, and he talks about Jim Corbett, especially when he talks about Rudraprayag and Corbett's man-eating leopard of Rudraprayag. And he talks about how the anecdotes about the tiger and the leopard, as it were, which the people thought was a sadhu who changed shape. And therefore, the deputy commissioner, Philip Mason, actually sort of had to imprison the sadhu, so that when the leopard made its next kill, it was conclusively proved that the sadhu was not the leopard who changed into a sadhu, and vice versa. Right. So he talks about Rudraprayag and he talks about Jim Corbett. Right. And then he also talks about Gupta Kashi. So you see, what he's also creating is a map for the traveler. Right. It's a map which Bond is following and which is the beaten trail for the traveler also. So he's taking the conventional route, whilst in some cases he's traveling off the beaten route. Remember that he's traveling there in October. So this is peak tourist season. I would know because I have traveled at least Badrinath and Gangotri in that same route. So he then talks about Gupta Kashi and how these places are made, these tourist towns are made by virtue of the people who are traveling, right? So Bond is suggesting that all these places are transformed by tourists whose economy seems to displace the people of the place. So the people become less important and tourism becomes more important, right? And therefore, he talks, and then he provides a delightful anecdote about a local bus, which is called Bhuk Hartal. And Bhuk Hartal is important because there was no bus actually for the local people apart from the tourist buses. So they protest, they stage a hunger strike, the Bhuk Hartal, from which the cure for the place, there is a bus, and that bus is named Bhuk Hartal. So in a sense, what Bond is also suggesting is, while these places are alive to the imagination of India because of its, as you could say, its interest, its holiness, it's a place which is infested with tourists, where the privileges of the tourists are important, but the privileges for the common people are not. So Bond's perspective is interesting. He's traveling as a tourist, but he's alert to the fact that these places provide very little facilities or infrastructure for the common people, right? And then he talks about Gupta Kashi, where the rivers Ganga and the Jamuna seem to converge, as it were, underground, and therefore, it is the hidden Benares. Kashi becomes the most important zone for, or the most important shrine for Hindus, as it were. So you have Gupta Kashi on the route to Badrinath, and you have also, on the route to Kedarnath, and you also have Uttar Kashi on the route to Badrinath. So Kashi, or Shiva, becomes very interesting. And in Uttarakhand, he suggests Jitne Kankar, Utne Shankar, as it were. There are numerous Shiva lingas, as it were, distributed across the territory. And therefore, this is the valley of the gods, as it were. And therefore, a sacrosanct, haloed place. I'll come to this point about Tirtha and tourism a little later on. But let me quickly move on to this concept of Kedarnath, of course. And he goes to the temple of Kedarnath, where, as it were, Shiva actually dresses as a bull and goes into the ground. Only the hump, as it were, is visible. And therefore, this is the account that he provides. And Bond, what he's doing is he's giving us the legends, right? So he's situated outside this realm of belief, but he provides the legends that are associated with the place. So in a certain sense, he's describing for also a non-European, for an European audience or a non-Indian audience, the importance of the place. So the temple is dedicated, he says, to Sadashiva, the subterranean form of the god, who, fleeing from the Pandavas, took refuge here in the form of a he-buffalo, and finding himself hard-pressed, dived into the ground, leaving the hinder parts of the surface, which continue to be the subject of adoration. Of course, Kedarnath is, if you look at this map, is one of the highest shrines that you have. Only Gangotri and Badrinath would be higher than that. Therefore, it's 13,000 feet. Now, there are certain empirical details that also Bond provides, the exact height of these places. So in a certain sense, it's also interesting because Bond is catering to a non-Indian audience, European audience, who will be traveling across the beaten tourist trail. At the same time, like an Indian, is also providing the familiarity with the people. At the same time, like an European, is providing us details of the colonial, history of these places. So it's interesting that he brings Hindu history and legend, he brings colonial history and legend, And he also talks about the contemporary sufferings and conditions of the people. So Bond is actually traveling across three kinds of time: the eternal time, the colonial time, and the present time. So it's in a certain sense also time travel that the Tirtha makes. And let me now very quickly go across to this idea about the Tirtha, right? And Bond suggests that, or let me first talk about this theory a little bit, so that you are alert to what Tirtha actually is. Now, you will find that, of course, the term Tirtha actually draws from three, right? And it suggests a certain amount of a sanctification of a place. So a sanctified place is Tirtha, right? So it's a noun. At the same time, you also say in Bangla or Hindi that amra tirtho korte jacchi, we are going to Tirth, right? We are going or doing a Tirth. So Tirtha is, in that sense, also a verb, right? So it plays between the noun and the verb. Now, according to the Hindu idea of the Tirtha is essentially a place also of self-cleansing, where a large amount of holy people gather, and thereby their combined punya of that place is heightened. So a Tirtha actually has 3 or 4 phases, right? The first is that you make a kind of a resolve, right? So you cannot randomly go for a Tirtha. Please remember this, that nowadays we travel as tourists to Kedarnath. But in the ancient times, to do a Tirtha, you had to do a certain resolution. So what you in Bengali would call a manath, right? Manut kora. So if this happens, ami ekhane giye pujo debo. This is something which even people in your households do right now, right? So Tirtha would be a certain resolution that I would go there for this particular purpose. The second thing is that the Tirtha involves a certain amount of klesha or effort, right? You remember that the Tirtha, of course, in the older times was not something which was very easy, right? Nowadays, you board a plane, you reach Delhi, you take a train, you reach Rishikesh, you take another helicopter, you reach Badrinath and Kedarnath, and you then fly back, right? But in the older times, Tirtha would involve tremendous amount of effort across very dangerous circumstances. So a trip to Kedarnath or Badrinath would mean traveling across hundreds of miles on foot or on horseback. And many people would die on the road. Now, if any of you are interested in working on Tirtha, I would invite you to watch a film called Moru Tirtho Hinglaj, where you, of course, will have that kind of a song, Pother Klanti Bhule, Sneho Bhara Kole Mago Kobe, Shital Habo. In that sense that, this is, the Tirtha is also this aim of making an effort. Now, in your immediate surroundings, you will have, people who walk on their breasts, dondi kata jetake bola hoy, right? That is also part and parcel of a religious effort, right? The third thing that happens in the Tirtha is reaching the Punya Bhumi and cleansing. You will find that most Tirthas in the Hindu pantheon and also elsewhere are associated with water. Now, water is both metaphorical as well as physical, in the sense that this ritual ablution, right, the snan, as it were, is cleansing your body as well as cleansing your soul, right? And therefore, with that cleansed soul, you actually bring back part of the tirtha phal, or the prasad from that particular place. Now, when you eat that prasad, or when you taste that prasad, you're not actually tasting the sweet, although most of us do that. So when somebody comes back from Sri Kshetra, that is Puri, and brings a little bit of jive goja for you, and you taste it and say it's very good, you are not actually tasting the jive goja at all. You are meant to taste the tirtha phal of that particular place, the combined punya which you are taking back. Now, if any of you in this class belong to the Muslim religion, you remember that the Hajj is exactly in the same way, that you are going there, touching the shrine, and when somebody comes back from the Hajj, if you remember, fellow Muslims will walk up and touch that person, because he's brought back some of the holiness of that place with him, right? So that's the structure of the Hindu tirtha. Now, why is the pilgrimage important in both Christian and Hindu traditions? Is that also in the Muslim tradition, is the pilgrimage is the only space where all classes and castes of people traveled together. Now, you remember Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. The pilgrimage is the only place where all classes of people could travel as a social body. Therefore, the distinctions between classes and castes, which were erstwhile present in society, are erased, as it were, or suspended temporarily in the pilgrimage journey, right? So the pilgrimage in that sense is also socially very important in bringing together various kinds of people. So it has its religious dimensions. It also has its social dimensions. Now, obviously, for Bond, who is traveling to these religious places, he's not traveling with any religious premeditation in that sense of the term. And therefore, he's slightly ironical, even skeptical about what the religious impact of the tirtha is. And he categorically states that I shall never make a good pilgrim. This is in the magic of Tunganath, he says, no reward for me in this world or the next. Right. But very importantly, he also understands that these tirthas are also associated, as you will find out, with not only rivers, but places of great scenic beauty. Now, why is this scenic beauty very important, and why are the hills so very important? In the sense that, you see, the religious is also mixed with the magical, right? So the religious elevates. The place of the tirtha, because of its aesthetics, also is something that elevates the mind and makes it sublime. So Bond, as the tourist, is alert to the sublime impact of natural beauty, right? And he correctly realizes that much of ancient Hindu religion is actually nature worship and plays a very important role in bringing man and nature together in a magical sort of atmosphere. And that is where he says that these locations become fundamentally important, right? So he then talks about Tunganath, and the next chapter is the magic of Tunganath. And he travels from Duirital, this is the route that he follows, Duirital to Chopta to Tunganath. And he talks about the local flora of the rhododendron there. He will later on talk about the Valley of the Flowers in Badrinath, but he also talks about the rhododendrons of Tunganath and the animals there, the combination of the rat and the rabbit, as it were, the pika of the local animals. So it's alert to the local flora and the fauna, as it were. But he suggests that Tunganath is so very picturesque primarily because its beauty has not yet been destroyed by the efforts of man. Right. And then he looks at certain isolated temples on the way which are not frequented by tourists, and their impact and their beauty on the roads. He's talking about Tunganath's height. And then he talks about the tung, as it were, which indicates the loftiness of Shiva, and therefore the history of the temple, as it were. But then there's an interesting episode that when coming down from Tunganath, Ruskin Bond actually slips and his watch breaks. But then he talks about time and how time is suspended in the hills. I think these are passages which you should be taking a very careful look at, because we have already argued that Bond's travelogue brings together the place and the self. The place is important, but equally important is the self and how Bond can look at these places. So when the watch breaks, Bond then goes into a trajectory about time, and he says, no matter, time here is of little or no significance. Away with time. So, suggesting that these mountains are eternal and that man is so puny and tiny that time does not matter here. But time is a very important theme in this travelogue because it brings together the Hindu eternal time, which is associated with divinity, the colonial British time, which is associated with a particular point of history, and present time, which is associated with tourism, and the present, as it were, defiling of the forests. Right. And then he talks about Hinduism. This is a passage which at the end of the magic of Tunganath is very important. You can take a look at this passage later on when I've finished with my classes. He says, I suppose Hinduism comes closest to being a nature religion. Rivers, rocks, trees, plants, animals, and birds all play their part, both in mythology and everyday worship. This harmony is most evident in these remote places where gods and mountains coexist. Tunganath exerts its magic on all those who come here with open mind and heart. You see, here, Bond is not judgmental. He sees Hinduism as, a nature religion associated with its Vedic traditions, with the trees, animals, and so on and so forth, and suggests that, it is this combination of nature and belief that makes the place magical. So from Bond, we do not get, a sense of elevation of the Tirtha itself. So there's no religious sanctification in this travel. Now, when a Hindu travels on a pilgrimage, the place becomes more than a place to him. It is associated with belief. It is associated with a certain amount of aura. And therefore, every small shrine would then create its own system of what we will call its divinity or its sense of sublimity. But for Bond, who provides the history, these places are sublime not because of their religious significance, although he indicates their significance. These are significant to him because of its natural beauty, and he can take an outsider's view of the Hindu religion, as it were. Now, then he comes to Badrinath, the road to Badrinath, and he talks about traveling across the Alakananda valley. And the Alakananda, he says, and he makes this distinction, that the Alakananda is awesome, precipitous, threatening, and seemingly inhospitable, as opposed to the Mandakini, which was far, as it were, amenable to human existence. Right, so the two aspects of the Ganga that he brings. So he travels across Chamoli, then he travels across the Dev Prayag, And of course, he talks about Badrinath as one of the four dhams. For those of you who are practicing Hindus, you should remember that the four dhams, the most holiest of Shiva and Vishnu dhams, are Rameshwaram, Badrinath, Dwarka, and Jagannath. So, Badrinath, therefore, in spite of not being a Kedar, it's not one of the Pancha Kedars. It therefore has an additional, by being one of the four major dhams of Hinduism, it is one of the holiest of places. Therefore, one of the most symbolic and, as it were, sublime for the Hindus. So, he says, for the pilgrim traveling to his holiest of holies, the journey is exciting, probably even uplifting. But he contrasts this with the people who live there. And he says, while these pilgrims are uplifted by this entire trip, the people who live here have to scrounge for a living. And therefore, many of them actually join the army. Right. And he talks about this entire, this entire hardship. And let me just share once again the kind of route that he follows. Just give me a minute, please. He's sharing this route that, from Chamoli to Helang. Right. At Helang, he meets a woman who's brought the husband in a critical condition to the hospital, and is already sort of dead by the time they've reached. And the woman can only sit and ponder over what has happened to the husband rather than do really anything. So, in a certain sense, Bond is also, this travelogue is not just about the river. It's also about, the pilgrim's perspective of the river, as well as the people's perspective of the terrain who live there, and the hardships of ordinary life of these people in the mountains. Right. And then he comes across a wishing tree and makes a wish, and so on and so forth, talks about Joshimat, and so on and so forth. And he quotes Frank Smith, one of the colonial travelers across Badrinath. He says, so they venture on their pilgrimage. This is Frank Smith. Some borne magnificently by coolies, some toiling along in rags. Europeans who have read and traveled cannot conceive what goes on in the minds of these simple folk, many of them from agricultural parts of India. Wonderment and fear are the prime ingredients. Please remember this. If you want to work on the pilgrimage, and if you are interested in the pilgrimage, what makes a pilgrimage? Wonderment and fear, right? Wonderment about the natural beauty, about the holiness of the shrine, and fear also because the journey is one of hardship. Klesha, as I pointed out. Unknown dangers threaten the broad, well-made path. The gods who hold the rocks in leash may unloose their wrath upon the hapless passerby. To the European, this is very interesting, the perspectives. It is a walk to Badrinath. To the Hindu pilgrim, it is far, far more. So this trip for Bond is a walk to appreciate natural beauty. But he recognizes that for his fellow Hindus, this walk is a walk towards, the realm of the gods and towards heaven. For many of them, of the ancient pilgrims, it was also a walk to their death. Now, many of you are, of course, aware of the journey to Shagor, the Shagor Deep, as it were, and the ashram of Kopil Muni and the Mala of Shagor. So many people actually travel in these times to the Shagor ashram to actually die in the Sangam and therefore attain, as it were, moksha or, freedom from death. If you've read your BG's book on Benares, you will remember that similarly, if you are if you're burnt at Dashashwamedh Ghat, they say that you are free from this cycle of life and death. So this place sanctification and that this complexity of the pilgrimage, that while there is holiness, belief, this wonderment, there's also fear and death. And therefore, the pilgrimage becomes for Bond a fascinating journey across the river, as it were. But then he's also skeptical because he meets one young sadhu who is speaking fair English. And he says that he's researching. And he says, what are you researching? He says, my special field of study, he informs us, is the part played by aeronautics in Vedic literature. So something which is in fashion nowadays, the study of the Vedas and the aeronautics and so on, and science of the Vedas. And Bond is very skeptical. And he says, what is the connection between the two? It is what I'm trying to find out, he replies. So periodically, while Bond is largely, Bond's perspective is largely neutral and sympathetic, periodically there is a skepticism at the kind of beliefs that are held about these places. Bond, of course, he clarifies himself, is agnostic in the sense that he does not believe in religion. Right, and then he talks about the mountains and the beauty of the mountains, because you see, across Badrinath, the peak that is seen is the Nilkanto Peak. And you'll remember that Badrinath is not a temple of Shiva. Badrinath is actually a temple of Vishnu, right? And therefore, Nilkanto Pahar, as they call it, the Nilkantha, is supposedly the mountain of Shiva when he sort of drank the poison of the Samudra Manthan, of the churning of the seas. Some of the poison actually turned his neck blue. So Nilkanto is the mountain which holds the poison of Shiva, right? And therefore, he looks at this kind of the mountain, and he wants to see the Nilkanto. Bond wants to see the Nilkantha range in its glory. In between, of course, he's visited the mandir, he's visited the temple, and he's indulged in a little bit of marketing. And he talks about his own fascination with trinkets and rings and how he buys them by the dozen and keeps them. And he's almost like a jackdaw in his attraction towards metallic rings. So what you see here is three things happening, or rather four things. One is there is an empirical description of the route, the legend, the kind of height above sea level. So a description of the place. Second is an explanation of the holiness of the place, in the sense, why is it legendary, or what legend does it hold? So it's narrating the Hindu significance. The third is the narration of the colonial history of the place. And fourthly, of course, there's a personal kind of reflection on the place and on life in general. So it is here you see that the travelogue and the self are integrally related with each other, so that the travelogue also becomes associated with the memoir. Remember that the travelogue in this particular case is about the Ganga, where it starts off with his own experience in Mussoorie. So Bond seems to enter into travel through the self, travel writing through the self. And it is here that you see that the memoir and the travel writing, the incursion of the self into travel, into the traveler's self, as it were, into the travel, becomes fundamentally important, right? But then, of course, he sees the Nilkanto Pahar, the Nilkanto hill in all its glory. And then he says, opening the window, I saw the rising sun touch down the snow-clad summit of Nilkantha. At first, snows were pink, then they turned to orange and gold. All sleep vanished as I gazed up in wonder at that magnificent pinnacle in the sky. And had Lord Vishnu appeared just then on the summit, I would not have been in the least surprised. So he's touched by by what I will call the sublimity of the sight. But you see, Bond being not a Hindu, and he's sort of, he's aware of these legends, but he takes an outsider's view in this particular case. So the pilgrimage from the inside and the pilgrimage from the outside. The next chapter is, of course, a very short chapter, and this is a journey to Nanda Prayag, and he talks about Nanda Prayag as across the river Nandakini, not the Mandakini, but Nandakini. And this is a less traveled route, right? And he talks about the old pilgrim route, and he meets one of the scholars in this field. Nandakini, by the way, Nanda Prayag is downhill, so it's just 3,000 feet. Consider that with Badrinath, which had been at almost 10,000 feet, right? So he meets a scholar and he learns about the history of the place and the legends associated with it. And he talks about Sister Nivedita's description of Nanda Prayag. In 1928, Sister Nivedita writes that Nanda Prayag is a place that ought to be famous for its beauty and order. So periodically, as I keep on saying, Bond is sort of moving back to the Europeans' perspective of these places. So he suggests that these places also have a very strong kind of a colonial history, which were discovered and then nurtured by the colonialists. And only then could the pilgrims actually go there in some comfort. Earlier, of course, they were associated with the Valley of the Gods and so on and so forth. And then he talks about the flowers, and finally talks about the youngsters who want to move away from Nanda Prayag to Mussoorie and then to Delhi. So, the pilgrims want to go to these places for sanctification, for elevation and sublimity, whilst the people on the hills actually sort of try to move from the hardship of the hills to the plains, where they think there is much more prosperity, opportunity, and diversity in life, right? So it's an interesting fact that whilst the pilgrims travel upwards and travel in search of holiness, the people who are there, for them, the river does not really mean much. And Bond makes an interesting point when he says that the people in these places do not depend upon the river, because the river is not static. The river flows fiercely downstream. Rather, they depend on the rains for their subsistence. So it's interesting in the sense that, there's the tourists' exoticization of the landscape, there's the pilgrims' sanctification of the landscape, and there is the people's hardship with the landscape and their desire to escape from it. So Bond is presenting all these perspectives when he's traveling he's taking a journey up the hill. As one of your travel writers, Vishwanath Ghosh, said, that travel writing is not just merely about the place, it's also equally about the people who constitute the place, who arrive at that place. So Bond talks about pilgrims, is equally talking about the hardship of the local population. Right, the final chapter of this segment is his journey to Gangotri, and he says Ganga descends. Now, of course, there's this debate about which is the source of the Ganga, or which is the real Ganga, the Alakananda or the Bhagirathi. And of course, the legend of Bhagirathi as coming out from the hair of Shiva is a more powerful legend. So Bhagirathi is considered to be the original Ganga, as it were. So he's traveling from Gangotri, and he says, we are now he quotes one of the colonial travelers writing in 1820, Bailey Fraser. We're now at the center of the Himalayas, the loftiest and perhaps the most rugged range of the mountains of the world. And therefore, he's taken in by the sublimity of the ruggedness of the terrain, right? And therefore, he travels to Gangotri. He talks about Deodar as being the principal tree there. And then he also talks about the colonizers, also the British. Especially, he talks about Wilson, Frederick Pahari Wilson of 1850s, who created this settlement, as it were, and introduced bridges and the Wilson apple, which is the staple fruit of this particular place. Right. So it talks about the legendary aspect, not only of Shiva and the Hindu pilgrims. It's also talking about the legends of the Britishers who've sort of once again reframed this place and made them, as it were, available for all and sundry. Right. He talks about the height of Gangotri, that is 10,300 feet. He talks about the temple of Gangotri, which was built by Amar Singh Thapa, Nepali general in the early 19th century. And then he talks about the Gaumukh, or the source of the Ganga. Having been there, I can tell you that the journey is from Gangotri to Gaumukh is a 14 plus 4, 18-kilometer journey, which with a stop at Bhujbasha. We actually had stopped at Bhujbasha, and I can share a personal anecdote that when my father at night wanted to go to the bathroom, and dipped his mug into the water, it was pure ice at that point of time. So you can understand the kind of cold that we faced, or people face, when they travel from Gangotri to Gaumukh. The last 4 kilometers of the Gangotri trip, of the Gaumukh trip, is sheer mountains. It's very difficult. But then once you arrive at the place and you see Ganga gushing out of that cave, it's a divine sight, really. And of course, at Gangotri again, it's the sound of the river. And very importantly, Bond is also talking about this sound of the river that kinds of echoes and permeates the hills. At every point you are aware that the river is there, it is flowing through. And at Gangotri Falls, in Gangotri, it comes with a deafening roar, so that when you rest at that falls, you are aware of the force of the river, right? And he spends this afternoon at the Gangotri Falls, and he talks about the pinkish cold that is guaranteed to transform your cheek into a pink frame. Right. Okay. Now then he travels back downstream, and he travels to Uttarkashi. And finally, this last phase of the travelogue, at least in the mountains across the Ganga, brings Bond to Tehri. And this is very interesting, because in 1992, when Bond is traveling in this particular area, the Tehri Dam is about to be built. Its construction had already started. And once the Tehri Dam was finally built, you see, the entire town of Tehri was submerged underwater, and therefore it became a ghost town. There are documentaries, of course, if you want to look at it in YouTube, at what earlier Tehri was like and what modern Tehri is like. And you will find that an entire town lies floating on the river because the dam had been built. And this brings, once again, Bond back to this issue of the dam. And Tehri, as it were, a small town in the hills, crowds, noise, traffic congestion, scruffy dabas. And then he says, all is ephemeral because Tehri is destined to be submerged by the waters of the Bhagirathi when the Tehri Dam is completed. Right. And then he says, perhaps Prince Bhagirath's chariot will come to a halt here too when the dam is built. The 246-meter high earthen dam with 42 square miles of reservoir capacity will submerge the town and about 30 villages. Please take a look at these YouTube videos since we are doing this, and you'll find this town now transformed into a ghost town. And he listens to the narrow bridge, the mighty blast from above, and hurtling down the defile just to remind us that the work is indeed in progress. Now, it is interesting because in the last line of this chapter, he describes Ganga herself. As for Ganga herself, the deceptively gentle river, I wonder if she will take kindly to our efforts to contain her. Right. Now, you see, the point is that Bond in his writings is not a very militant or active environmentalist in that sense of the term. There's a love for nature, identification with nature, but he does not have the, what I can say, the eagerness or the extreme energy of the environmentalist. He's not a fanatic in that sense of the term, but he very subtly and in minor details, or in kind of minor parts of the text, he makes us aware of the degradation caused to the environment, and very often the human intervention within the environment, which can prove to be counterproductive. So Bonds is primarily a traveler. Bond is primarily a traveler with his own kind of selfhood, reacting, describing, and interacting with the people and nature. But there are shades of environmentalism within him, and his awareness that tampering with the environment might invite rebuke from the gentle river which flows across. Now, it's interesting because what have these 5 chapters then brought together, and this is where I'd like to sort of wind up whatever threads I've sort of put across. Bond makes this point. He travels across the shack, these tourist trails to these places, describes the people, the bazaars, describes the tourists. At the same time, Bond also describes the people of these places, their struggles with life. And clearly there are two kinds of Ganga here. One Ganga which belongs to the tourists, which is holy, which is sanctified, and which leads to the places of tremendous sublimity and faith, the valley of the gods, as it were. On the other hand, there is the Ganga which flows freely across this particular region of the Garhwal, which does not really benefit these people because it is too fast flowing for them, and therefore they are dependent largely on the rains. It's a territory that is hostile, a life that is extremely marked by poverty and hardship. It's a life that they want to escape from. So there is one set of people who wish to travel up the Ganga to the holy places, for whom the place holds sanctification and the river is one of the sources of greatest punya for them. But on the other hand, there's another set of people for whom, the river really does not mean much apart from hardship and a great amount of poverty. Outside these two worlds of the Ganga is Ruskin Bond, the observant eye of the Anglo-Indian who is at once empathetic with the hardship of these people, who can, look neutrally at the faith of the Hindus, but at the same time is also conscious that these places have been also haunted by the Europeans and is an important and integral part of colonial history. So Bond is also situating within these people, the tourists and the people who are living there, the legendary Europeans like Mason, like Corbett, like Wilson, who have been an integral part of this territory. And therefore Bond is trying to suggest, just as he is integrating himself within the Indian body, as it were, is indicating that colonial history is as much part of India as the ancient history of the Vedas and so on and so forth. So is in that sense talking about Indian history like the Ganga, which is made of various strands and streams, suggesting that Indian history is made of various times, the Vedic, the colonial, and the modern, and all of them have to be accommodated within the body of this particular country, as it were. So The text and the travelogue, therefore, while it meanders from one zone to another, from self to the pilgrimage and to the people around it, it is a travelogue of accommodation. It is a travelogue which is sensitive to the environment, a travelogue which talks about Hinduism's close association with nature, and it also talks about the accommodation of various histories, ancient, colonial, and postmodern, within its body politic. So I think therein lies the importance of this travelogue in bringing together these different notions of time within itself. Right. Let me that's what I had to say today, but let me take the questions, because I can see that there are a few questions. Thank you for putting them. If you have any questions in today's lecture, I would expect them tomorrow, I guess. Shamarpon is asking me, is Bond playing a role of interpreter between the Indian and the European readers? Yes, to a certain extent. Because you see, whenever Bond is writing an English text, he's not merely writing for Indian readers as such. He's also writing for readers who would visit and Uttarakhand does draw a large amount of tourists who are visiting these places in search of the holiness of the place also, as well as the beauty of the place. So you're right there. Bond is playing an role of interpreter between the Indian and the European readers. But Shamarpon, I would invite you to also think about this. Is Bond playing an interpreter between the child as the reader of the travelogue and the adult as the reader of the travelogue? So it's also sort of providing details for the child, anecdotes for the child, taking him through. So in that sense, he's opening up also the eyes of the child as the traveler. But I agree with you that he's playing the role of the interpreter between Indian and European readers. This other perspective, Shorab has written, is the European perspective, since he's also taking a walk to Badrinath and observes the Hindu pilgrims, their rituals and beliefs, much like the Europeans. Yes, Bond, you see, let's not just talk it about in European perspective, because then that becomes a completely outsider's perspective. But you see, when you travel to a mosque or when you travel to a church, right, as a Hindu, then you are outside that religion. You see the people praying, you see their rituals, I observe them and you note them, right? That does not make him merely an European. It also makes him, in a certain sense, an Anglo-Indian. In that sense, he of course would not like to talk about it as Anglo-Indian, is as a Christian Indian, as it were. There are different Indians here. There's a Muslim Indian, there's a Christian Indian, there's a Hindu Indian, right? Each of us have our own set of rituals. And so somebody, when outside, he looks at the rituals and he narrates them. He can narrate them in various ways. He can narrate them without any kind of judgment. He can narrate them with a lot of irony and depreciation, and he says these are all foolish rituals. And he can also praise them very much. Bond's stance here is that of the neutral observer, right? So I wouldn't say he's just European, but yes, he has European lineages. But he claims to be an Indian. So his is a non-Hindu perspective to a Hindu pilgrimage, right? That's as far as what I would suggest. The title is also hinting at the oneness of man and nature. All roads lead to the Ganga. Yes, in the sense that, as it were, from Rudraprayag, you have various roads leading up to different parts of the Ganga. And I point out the Ganga, as it were, is not one river. You have to remember this, Shorab. It is one river only and only when it comes to Devaprayag. And after that, it flows into, Rishikesh. But even then, after that, there's also Prayag, if you remember. You have at Allahabad the Prayag. You have the Hooghly river coming into it and mixing with it. You have the Brahmaputra coming and meeting the Ganga right at the end of the river's run. So Bond is suggesting that there are various kinds of people, perspectives, which form the Ganga. So all roads lead to the Ganga. I'm tempted really, although Bond does not make this point, that the Ganga is a symbol of India. Why? Because the Ganga is about these confluences, it's about these mergings, and different identities of the river lose themselves once they come to the Ganga, right? And therefore, this entire course of history, nation, Ganga remains this kind of a microcosm of the nation, which brings together the different srots, the different kinds of flows. I'm tempted to do that, but you see, Bond in this particular travelogue does not want that kind of a philosophy to, the political philosophy, to impinge. He would rather talk about time, he would rather talk about the mountains and their eternity, and so on and so forth. But that is one reading that you can surely bring into the text. And thus, through this oneness, is Bond trying to define or pave new ways for traveling, travel writing. Yes, in a sense that all the Gangas come and merge in his travel writings, but and in his consciousness, as it were. Now, that's an interesting point that Saurabh is making. But you see, the point is that, all this is seen through the eyes of Ruskin Bond, right? And therefore, you can suggest that, it is within the traveler and the self of the traveler that all the perspectives of travel seem to merge, as it were. But of course, there might be different perspectives of the pilgrimage, as it were, in different travel writings. Say, Morutitto Hinglaj would be one of the most important books on travel, especially to the mountains, that you could read, right? Mahaprasthane, and then you could also talk about different perspectives of travel writing, where these different rivers come to meet. So yes, in this particular text, all these perspectives come and meet within the selfhood of Ruskin Bond. Right, those were the questions for today. I hope I've answered them to your satisfaction. If not, you can always tell me that you would like a more detailed clarification. And regarding today's lecture, of course, you're free to put your questions tomorrow, right? And therefore, it is with that I bring today's discussion to a close. We'll have one final discussion on Ruskin Bond tomorrow, where I intend to wind up on the last chapters of the travelogue and make a few general comments about the structure and the importance of the travelogue in this particular case. Thank you for having attended the class, and see you tomorrow at 10:30 once again. Have a good day.